First things first, I want to welcome the brethren who are with us today, both from the Grand Lodge of Washington and from the Prince Hall Grand Lodge. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I'm also pleased to see that even though this is a District 13 Zoom, that we have brethren from all over the state, from Bellingham and from oh, look at Steve Daisy from the East Side's with us. That's lovely. And of course, our guest speaker. Everybody who's been Grandmaster has got his own personal Mount Rushmore. You have the four or however many people you want to put on that Mount Rushmore who inspire you. For me, that Mount Rushmore obviously includes Thornton McElroy and Thomas M. Reed. And then from a modern day standpoint, I'm struggling with the quote unquote fourth person because many of those people that inspire me are still alive, like Al Jorgensen and Bill Miller, Sat Toshiro as well. But there's a spot that's definitely up there, and that spot belongs to one William H. Upton. And before I do that, it's good to see past Grandmaster Brown here. Good to see you, my most worshipful brother.
Great to be seen. Great to see you too, Jim.
So I went looking for somebody who could share with us some information about Most Worshipful Brother Upton, because in my viewpoint, he's one of the most seminal grandmasters. He's one of the most seminal gentlemen to ever serve as Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Washington, and the impact that he had has been long lasting.
Don't steal my thunder, Most Worshipful.
I know. I'm getting now. It's time for me to introduce you. Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce someone who I've developed a very nice friendship with. He was senior grand warden under a certain leadership, under a certain grandmaster who shall remain nameless. But also he past master of William H. Upton Naval and Military Lodge out in Bremerton. So it's my pleasure today to introduce you to Most Worshipful Brother Jim Kendall. Jim, take it away.
Thank you, Most Worshipful Brother Jim. Appreciate the opportunity. Brothers, it's good to see you all. I hope that when I'm done with this little presentation, you aren't disappointed and perhaps you've learned something. And we'll open it up for an opportunity that if you have something to offer, we can learn from you. This is not a one-way street by any means. You know, there's an old saying that if you want to learn something, teach it. And I found that to be absolutely true. That if you have a topic that you're asked to teach that perhaps you're not comfortable that you know it well enough, you do some research, and before you know it, by golly, you've learned quite a bit that you didn't know before, or found out things that you've plain forgot. So Most Worshipful Brother William H. Upton was a very unusual man from today's standpoint. He's what we would call a type A personality, and perhaps you could call him the Energizer Bunny of the 1890s. He was involved in several major offices and projects, often at the same time. So I'm going to go through a timeline that I put together just to give you a feel for who this man was. So he was born June 19 of 1854 in Weaverville, California. He was brought up in Oregon, went to the schools in Portland, and then went to Yale University, where he graduated in 1877. He then went to graduate school and graduated from Columbia University, and I'm sure that was with a law degree. He got married in 1881, and he served in the office of the Secretary of the Navy for several years. He was admitted to the bar in Washington, D.C. Duh, he was a lawyer. He later moved to Walla Walla, and he practiced law in Walla Walla and in Seattle at the same time. In 1888, he was elected to the City Council of Walla Walla. In 1888, he was elected to the legislature. In 1888, he was elected a judge of the Walla Walla and Franklin counties on the Superior Court. So he's a triple hitter. In 1890, check this date, the year, he was made a Mason in Blue Mountain Lodge number 13 in Walla Walla, Washington. In 1892, only 2 years later, he was master of that lodge. So you see, we're not the only ones that sometimes have guys that kind of have to jump through the chairs. In 1886, I have 19 here, he was elected senior Grand Warden. Now, some of these biographies say that he was elected junior Grand Warden in that year, and that's not true. In fact, he was only in the Grand Line for 3 years, moving up to the Grand Master. And the reason he was elected senior Grand Warden, as we have seen in recent years, there's a brother who, for one reason or another, can't proceed. John Kelleher was junior Grand Warden and did not move forward because of health. Same situation at that time. The junior Grand Warden had health issues, so he was elected. Wait, I'm hearing somebody. He was elected as senior Grand Warden, then as Deputy Grand Master, and finally Grand Master. In 1886, as the senior Grand Warden, he was selected to a committee of 3 to address the issue of Negro Masonry, and this took him into his Deputy Grand Master year. And the reason this came up, and I'll get into a little more detail, was that 2 black Negro, as they called them, black Masons from 2 other jurisdictions wrote letters to the Grand Lodge requesting that there be some avenue open to them so that they could visit our lodges. So this committee investigated those letters and went further, and as a consequence, Brother Upton did more research into the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, how it came about, what the history was, and as a consequence of that, then they made their report. The report that they made is extensive, and it is, as Jimmy said earlier, this is a lawyer who lays the case out wonderfully. And there were some questions that they needed to answer. One of them was the preliminary questions were about Prince Hall. Let me read this to you. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to memorize this. I'm going to read it. 2 Masons. Even from the standpoint of Negro lodges, we learned that both are reputable citizens of this state, residents of Seattle. Mr. Bailey was formerly a justice of the peace in King County, and Mr. Rideout is a practicing attorney. So these are upstanding men of the community. Mr. Bailey's Masonic standing from the standpoint of Negro bodies is unexceptionable. Not sure what that word means, except it's okay. He received the degrees in a lodge chartered by the Grand Lodge of Illinois. The latter body was formed by lodges chartered by the Colored Grand Lodge of Ohio, and the latter by lodges chartered by the Colored Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, a body which was formed in 1815 by lodges existing by authority derived from Prince Hall, of whom we shall speak further. And he follows through the history very well. Being satisfied that the petition comes from men who are acting in good faith and is entitled to respectful consideration, your committee found themselves confronted at the outset by the question whether a Grand Lodge is the body to which this application should have been made. Normally, no. Let's see, I don't want to read all this, I want to skip through it. Not ignoring the fact that Grand Lodges have not infrequently appeared to consider themselves authorized to dispose of questions like those presented by this petition, your committee are inclined to doubt whether the question whether a particular man shall be recognized as a brother Mason does not fall to the lodge rather than the Grand Lodge, and that would be the normal course. The question of the legitimacy of the lodges among the colored men of the United States is no new one. It has been warmly and ably discussed from time to time, and was quite fully examined over 20 years ago when a proposal in the White Grand Lodge of Ohio, recommended by the Grand Master and favorably reported by the committee, to which it had been referred to recognize as a lawful body the Negro Grand Lodge, which has existed in that state since 1849. As you go through these examples that they outline, you see that they followed the history of the Prince Hall, the black or Negro lodges from the very beginning. The rationale for this goes back to the Africa Lodge, which was started by Prince Hall, and back to Prince Hall through a series of events. Well, first off, let's back all the way back. Prince Hall and I believe it was 13 other Black Masons were raised in a regimental lodge. And at the end of the War of 1776, that regiment went away and the Masons stayed. Well, they wanted to form a lodge. They finally wound up petitioning the Grand Lodge of England, and they were granted a charter by the Grand Lodge of England. Now, here's where some of the controversy falls in. How can a single lodge sponsor another lodge? Doesn't that have to come from a Grand Lodge? Well, historically, even into fairly recent history, no. A lodge can form another lodge, and they can form a Grand Lodge when they have sufficient lodges. There is a strong case to be made that Prince Hall was a provincial Grand Master, even though there was only one lodge at the time. Provincial Grand Masters had the authority to operate as a Grand Master in that jurisdiction, in that area, under the guidance of the Grand Lodge of England. Perfectly normal according to the times that were happening then. Brother Prince Hall, a man of exceptional ability, worked zealously in the cause of Masonry, and from 1792 until his death in 1807, exercised all the functions of a provincial Grand Master. In 1797, he issued a license to 13 black men who had been made Masons in England to assemble and work as a lodge in Philadelphia. Another lodge was organized by his authority in Providence, Rhode Island. In 1806, these three lodges joined in forming the African Grand Lodge of Boston, now the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and Masonry gradually spread over the land. So you see, this is all perfectly proper, regular as can be. The patents of the Prince Hall line of succession is every bit as valid as those that come to us. Now, in my reading here, it apparently, and I didn't know this, I'd like to confirm it, that the Grand Lodge of Washington, excuse me, according to this, actually was apparently chartered or approved by the Grand Lodge of Virginia. I didn't know that. I knew that there were other Grand Lodges involved, but at least that's what he says. I mean, through Oregon and California and so on, I'm guessing. The second colored Grand Lodge, called the First Independent African Grand Lodge of North America in and for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, these three grand bodies fully recognized each other in 1847. I skipped one. By joining and forming a national Grand Lodge, now virtually extinct. And as practically all the Negro lodges in the United States are descendants from one or the other of these, we need pursue the history no further. So what he is saying in his research is what I have just expressed, that the Prince Hall lodges and the Grand Lodges are regular in the eyes of Masonry. They're not clandestine. They're not in any way unsuitable to be called a Mason. Now, if this Grand Lodge recognized that. So get back to my outline, if I can find it. What do I do with it? Rolled it up and smoked it, I guess. Hello, organized, who? Ah, buried. In 1898, he was elected Grand Master, and that was after he had not been a Master Mason for quite 8 years. Kind of a meteoric rise, you'd say. We have a recent Grand Master who was Grand Master after only something like 15 years as a Master Mason, and that's Don Monks. He spent enormous amount of energy and time during his year as Grand Master responding to other Grand Lodges who objected to the basically 4 resolutions that were passed. Somebody's doing something. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit, and I'm going to read the resolutions or the recommendations of this report. Having thus set forth our views upon the important subject submitted to us, your committee now submit to the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge 4 resolutions and recommend that they be adopted to wit. Now, the resolutions were not in the lengthy form the way we do them now. It was simply their recommendation. Resolved that in the opinion of this Grand Lodge, Masonry is universal, and without doubt, neither race nor color are among the tests proper to be applied to determine the fitness of a candidate for the degrees of Masonry. And even much further back than that, that was the common accepted practice. Didn't matter what the color of your skin was, didn't matter if you were Hindu, didn't matter if you were Christian, Catholic, Muslim, whatever. Those were not tests that we were allowed to make. Resolved that in view of recognized laws of the Masonic institution and of facts of history apparently well authenticated and worthy of full credence, this Grand Lodge does not see its way clear to deny or question the right of its constituent lodges or of the members thereof to recognize as brother Masons Negroes who have been initiated in lodges which can trace their origin to Prince Hall Lodge number 459, organized under the warrant of our Right Worshipful, RW, I'm guessing. Oh, Right Worshipful Brother Thomas Howard, Earl of Effington, acting Grand Master, under the authority of His Royal Highness Henry Frederick, Duke of Cumberland, etc., Grand Master of the most ancient and honorable society of free and accepted Masons in England, bearing date September 29, AL 5784, or to our Right Worshipful Brother Prince Hall, Master of said lodge, and in the opinion of this Grand Lodge, for the purpose of tracing such origin, the African Grand Lodge, Boston, organized in 1808, subsequently known as the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, the first African Grand Lodge in North America, and for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, organized in 1815, and the Hiram Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania may justly be regarded as legitimate Masonic Grand Lodges. That's pretty straightforward. There's no ambiguity there. There's no side door that you can bail out on. Very clear. Should not be controversial either. All the reasoning for reaching this conclusion has been presented. Resolved that while this Grand Lodge recognizes no difference between brethren based on race or color, it is not unmindful of the fact that the white and colored races in the United States have in many ways shown a preference to remain in purely social matters separate and apart. In view of this inclination of the two races, Masonry being preeminently a social institution, this Grand Lodge deems it to the best interest of Masonry to declare that if regular Masons of African descent desire to establish within the state of Washington lodges confined wholly or chiefly to brethren of their race, and shall establish such lodges strictly in accordance with the landmarks of Masonry, and in accordance with the Masonic law as heretofore interpreted by Masonic tribunals of their own race, and if such lodges shall in due time see fit to, in like manner to erect a Grand Lodge for the better administration of their affairs, this Grand Lodge, having more regard for the good of Masonry than for any mere technicality, will not regard the establishment of such lodges or Grand Lodge as an invasion of its jurisdiction. Important point. But as evincing a disposition to conform to its own ideas as to the best interests of the craft under peculiar circumstances, and will ever extend our colored brethren its sincere sympathy and every effort to promote the welfare of the craft or inculcate the pure principles of our art. Lengthy, but to the point. Resolved that the Grand Secretary be instructed to acknowledge receipt of the communication from Gideon S. Bailey and Con A. Rideout, and forward to them a copy of the printed proceedings of this annual communication of the Grand Lodge as a response to their letters. There were several objections to admitting the regularity of Prince Hall Masons. That last piece alluded to one of them, which was the jurisdiction issue. A good deal of this committee report discussed the fact that the issue of having one jurisdiction in a geographic area is a new invention, and that is strictly American. It is not one of the landmarks of Masonry, but the Grand Lodges of the United States decided that that would be the premise under which they worked. Even having said that, early on, there were states that had 2 and even 3 Grand Lodges that were recognized, that were operating in the same geography. He goes on to explain that when we talk about a jurisdiction, we're not talking about geography. A jurisdiction for our purposes means that the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Washington encompasses only lodges who are members of the Grand Lodge of Washington. That's the jurisdiction of Washington, not the state of Washington. It happens that over this long term in America, the lodges and the brothers have decided that they will simply state that the states or the territories are included in the jurisdiction. Technically speaking, it is the lodges who make up the jurisdiction, not the state. So the argument about having more than one Grand Lodge in a jurisdiction is fallacious. It's not true. In fact, I think Sam Roberts pointed out that in the state of Washington there are actually 4 Grand Lodges, only 2 of which we consider regular, ours and Prince Hall. And then there's the other 2 that you're probably aware of. I already talked about in outline the validity of the charters of the Grand Lodges, the origins. I didn't go into any great detail, but the outline and the invasion of jurisdiction I just talked about. And they pointed out in England from 1725 to 1813, there were always 2 Grand Lodges. And at times there were 3 or 4. In Scotland, there were for years a Grand Lodge and a Mother Lodge. And in early Irish history, we find 2 Grand Lodges. In Prussia alone, there are now and long have been 3. So being then not a landmark, but the result of a revolution from ancient usage, it seems evident to your committee that this doctrine cannot be justly or logically applied to test the regularity of the Negro lodges. And he emphasizes at the end of this section, again, the jurisdiction is not over land or geography. The question of free or freeborn keeps coming up. And it turns out that really this freeborn thing is in the ritual of the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons, but appears nowhere else. The term and the objective was a free man, not freeborn. And the reason that was a issue was that if a slave was made a Mason and he was in lodge and his owner came in to yank him out, we got a problem. So in order to avoid that, the Masonic fraternity said, to be a Mason, you need to be a free man, etc. So he put short shrift to that. I already talked about the legitimacy. Talked about the right to visit. Now, again, this is back in 1897 when this was presented to the Grand Lodge. Under these circumstances above, we think the prayer of the petitioner should be granted if practicable. Lawyerese, sorry. The prayer is that the Grand Lodge devise some way whereby they may be brought into communication with their white brethren. We do not construe this prayer as asking that the harmony of our lodges be disturbed by the admission of unwelcome members or visitors. If we did, we should not hesitate to say to the petitioners that the doctrine that no man can be enter a brother in any particular lodge or admitted to a member thereof without the unanimous consent of all the members of that lodge who are present. I'm skipping a lot of this because we, number one, don't have time, but we're laying the groundwork for any questions or anything you care to add to the conversation. So that was the, in general, an outline of what the report was to the Grand Lodge. You'll excuse the expression, but it wasn't long after that was passed that all hell broke loose with other Grand Lodges. And it started with apparently a telegram or something was sent to one of the other Grand Lodges, I believe it was Kentucky, that completely misconstrued what the resolution said. And somehow or another, the idea got out there very quickly to all the other Grand Lodges that what the Grand Lodge of Washington was saying is that we could recognize other Grand Lodges in other jurisdictions without referring to that Grand Lodge. So it got out that we were going to recognize Prince Hall Grand Lodges in Massachusetts and Kentucky and wherever else they were, which was absolutely not the case. Absolutely not the case. And in the letters that he wrote and in the address to the brethren that he presented, and I'm going to bring that up here. See if I can, here we go. Here we go. Here's a biographical sketch, which includes his address, I believe. Here we go. And keep going here. Foreign relations. Oh my God. When we parted last year, I rejoiced that for the first time in many years, the Grand Lodge, you guys are covering me up here. Can I, there we go. Can I get that down? Yeah, there we go. I regret more than words can express that the failure on the part of certain brethren in other jurisdictions to appreciate the responsibilities of the position that they had undertaken to till when called upon as committeemen to advise their Grand Lodges of their proper relation toward a subject which you were called upon to consider last year has placed us in a far different position. So he talks about 4 jurisdictions. These were kind of normal issues. Request for recognition, and he addressed that. In New York, he says, I should not mention this Grand Lodge in this connection, but for the fact that it has been frequently stated in print during the year that the fraternal relations between the Grand Lodge and this had been severed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The relations between the 2 Grand Lodges continue to be, and I trust they always will be, the most fraternal and cordial character. So he explains how this controversy started. The story originated in the fact that the Most Worshipful Grand Master of New York misunderstood a resolution adopted by us last year, showing his displeasure by writing a letter to a brother of his whom he erroneously supposed to be a representative of this Grand Lodge near the Grand Lodge of New York, requesting him to resign that position and cause the letter to be printed in the newspapers. Well, that's where it started. In West Virginia, the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of West Virginia held its annual communication last November, and I find in its printed proceedings no indication of any dissatisfaction toward this Grand Lodge. But in the January following, the Most Worshipful Grand Master of West Virginia addressed a letter to his representative near this Grand Lodge, Most Worshipful Brother James R. Hayden, withdrawing the latter's appointment and expressing dissatisfaction with your action last year upon the Colored Mason's petition. In March, his worshipful wrote me in somewhat the same strain, but his language is indefinite and neither letter indicates the exact nature of his complaint. So you're reading this with me, I hope. They indicate, however, that there is some old edict of his Grand Lodge which renders it improper for another Grand Lodge to receive a petition from a colored man. I do not understand that your amicable relations with the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of West Virginia are in any ways impaired. Don't know how that came in there. Kentucky. In October 1898, Grandmaster Reginald Heber Thompson, in his address to the Grand Lodge on Negro considered its action undignified, unmasonic, revolutionary, and uncalled for.
Hang on, Jim. Something's happening with your mic. You need to unmute.
There we go. Unmute.
There we go. You're good.
Am I good? Okay. Oh, now I lost my place. Where was I? Where are you? Your screen sharing is paused.
Revolutionary and uncalled for is where you are. Is where you're at.
So here we go. Blink.
You're on Kentucky.
They state that the Grand Lodge of Washington has hastened to adjudicate. Hello? Who's that?
Yeah, you're good. Go ahead.
After further comments on the hysterical vaporing of the fire committee, notice how insulting this is? I mean, it's just, it adds that your action was had upon what seems to have been an agreed case. It, Washington, has been forgetful of its own dignity, reckless of its own honor, and zealous to disturb the harmony of the craft. Thereupon, the Grand Lodge of Kentucky declared non-intercourse with Washington. There are letters in this other booklet, he quotes verbatim from a couple of Grand Lodges that are simply horrible. Horrible. It's the only way they could be described. And then he responded to the Grand Lodges and explained that no, our actions were misrepresented and we did not do what we were accused of. And the reports got spread around and they were heavily edited and misrepresented on several points what the resolutions did. So he states the real facts as to our position are these. Probably 19 out of every 20 members of our Grand Lodge believe, with brothers Albert Pike and T.S. Parvin, that the colored organization are as regular as the white. Yet, because we knew that some brethren in Pennsylvania and elsewhere thought otherwise, and because of our desire for harmony, the Grand Lodge of Washington carefully abstained from expressing any such opinion and contented itself with declaring that it did not see its way clear to deny the right of its lodges or their members to recognize as Mason Negroes who could trace their Masonic origin to a certain lodge warranted by the Grand Master of England. I see no problem with that myself. He had earlier quoted Albert Pike, and Albert Pike had very strongly stated that he believed that the Black Lodges were in fact regular lodges, but that he personally refused to sit in lodge with a Negro, and that if a Negro is admitted to his lodge, he would demit and quit Masonry. Now, very unfortunate. Albert Pike had a lot of good qualities, but he was just a flat out and out racist, and we can't deny that. From his own words, we know that. But he did agree that the Prince Hall Masons were, in fact, as regular as white Masons. The case has been made, and I think a strong case, that a lot of the objections, especially from the southern jurisdictions, are based on racism and the color of the skin, my personal opinion. And William H. Upton alluded to that, although he didn't come right out and say it, that he believed the same in many of the cases of those who objected to what the Grand Lodge of Washington did. Advice from Grand Masters. Well, I'm not going to go into that because it's just more of the same. I will say that in, I believe it was 1906, in that grand annual communication, the quote-unquote offending resolutions were withdrawn, rescinded. William H. Upton was hurt, deeply, deeply hurt and disappointed that that happened. One of the things he did is he put in his will that until such time as the white Masons and the Negro Masons could sit and lodge together, he would not have a monument on his grave. He had a grave marker, there was no monument. And in 1990, the Grand Lodge of Washington passed the resolution that recognized the Grand Lodge of Prince Hall was regular. And arrangements were made so that we could sit and lodge together. I'm not sure myself, and maybe Jimmy knows, whether we took the step of doing full recognition or not. I think we did, but I'm not sure of that. But in any case, in 1991, we had a joint service in Walla Walla where a monument to William H. Upton was erected in recognition of his efforts to bring Masonry on the level. It is my opinion, and I'm going to stop sharing here if I can figure out how. So how do we do that, Jimmy? Jimmy.
Just go to the top and you should see something called stop share. Should be a drop-down menu that says stop share.
Yeah.
Actually, I can do it. I'll do it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Great. Okay. So there's the handsome me again. It is my opinion, and I agree with Jim, that William H. Upton was a Mason we could all look to. He was a special man, a special Mason, and he certainly would belong on a Masonic Mount Rushmore, in my view. I think he may be one of the, if not the most consequential, then one of the most consequential Masons in any Grand Lodge in our history of Masonry in America. He stood up for his principles. He stood up for the Masonic principles. He was a Masonic scholar. He was a Shriner. I believe that he was Scottish Rite as well. He wrote a paper that was 300 and some pages long of the letters, or he compiled the letters of Prince Hall and had those published. The guy just was phenomenal. Now, are there other Masonic scholars of note? Of course there are. But his Masonry was put into action. Brothers, that's my brief presentation. I think I covered most of what needed to be covered. There's certainly more. If you're interested in getting these documents that I'm reading from, Jimmy knows how to get a hold of me, and I'll send them to you. We're also going to try to get that posted up on our website. With that, Most Worshipful Jim, back to you.
Thank you, Most Worshipful Sir. So we've got a couple links posted on the in the chat. One of them is the link to the memorial service, the joint memorial service for that was done with the two Grand Lodges here in Washington at the Upton grave site. It is an hour long, and it is worth your time. It is really worth your time to sit there. And there's another link here, but there seems to be some dispute there, but so I'll just leave that be. So I would ask, because we do have some Prince Hall brethren with us here today, and I thank you for your presence. I would welcome your insights with respect to what you've heard today, or what, or maybe anything that, again, it's tough to talk about William Upton in a half an hour's time. So I would, look, it's Brother Bowers is up there nodding his head. So I would welcome, I would this time welcome your insights. So just feel free to unmute yourself, and I'll be happy to entertain this. Now keep in mind, I know I've got some leaders here from Prince Hall. I will call on you. I am not afraid to do that. So either you step up, or I'm going to call on you. Just let you know. Look.
I'm just waiting for Most Worshipful Trout to go first.
There There you go.
Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see all of you. I didn't hear every bit of it, but I did have the privilege of being present for a lot of what was just talked about. And if I'm not mistaken, what past Grandmaster Upton said was that he didn't want a marker placed on his grave until white and black Masons could reach across his grave and shake hands and recognize each other. And it was, if I'm not mistaken, the date was not 1991, it was 1992. And we have pictures of the event and of the Grand Master of your Grand Lodge and past Grand Master Daniel L. Lunsford of our Grand Lodge reaching across that grave and shaking hands in Walla Walla, Washington. And as it relates to some of the other parts in that report, you know, our Grand Lodge was formed not from West Virginia, but from Illinois. And there were 3 lodges, one in Portland, Oregon, and another one, Washington Lodge in Seattle, and an Inland Empire Lodge number 53 in Spokane, Washington. And those 3 lodges are the ones that formed the Grand Lodge of Washington. It was called, at the time, it was the Grand Lodge of Washington and Oregon, and a few years later, it was incorporated as the Grand Lodge, parentheses, African of Washington. And so there has always been some skepticism about who's who and who has, you know, who wants to recognize whom. And I didn't hear it in Brother Kendall's report, but it was the way I knew it back then, which is almost 30 years ago, and memory is not as good as it used to be. But I think Grandmaster Upton gave, or the Grand Lodge of Washington, under his leadership, gave recognition to us. And as a result, there were other Grand Lodges, white, that withdrew recognition of your Grand Lodge because of what he did and what your Grand Lodge did. And so it really caused a stink. And then lodges all over the U.S. started withdrawing fraternal relations with you. And so it went on, but I think that what's important to think about now, Most Worshipful Brother Kendall was talking about jurisdiction, and what does that mean? And mentioned that it means that you're over the lodges you're over, that is your jurisdiction. And so how would any Grand Lodge in any state have the authority to say that another Grand Lodge is or is not legitimate, legal, regular, whatever those things are? Every Grand Lodge is autonomous. Nobody has any authority over anybody. New York has, I don't know how many Grand Lodges, but many, many Grand Lodges. And the idea that there was a time when there was a huge fight over Black or African American Grand Lodges in New York, and the Grand Master Prince Hall was taking every legal action he could to establish that Prince Hall was the only legitimate Grand Lodge of Black Masons. Well, that just doesn't work. And maybe the reason it doesn't work is because the lodges we have under us encompass our jurisdiction. And so I don't imagine you wanted me to talk all night, but the other thing I'll mention is originally, when we talk about these resolutions, your lodge did a resolution, and you mentioned 1990, and I can't dispute that. But when it happened, your lodge did a resolution, and our Grand Lodge did a resolution as well. You were recognizing us as regular and legitimate, and we were doing the same thing with you. And then we began to have visitation, and I don't know about the western side of Washington, but on the eastern side of Washington, we had many times when we participated together in degree work. And we raised many Masons. Oh, that's another thing I meant to mention. Back there when Prince Hall and 13 others were going over to England to get a charter, they did have lodge meetings, but the only thing they could do was have funerals and something. There were two things they could do, but they couldn't make Masons. And so that lodge you talked about, the Army Lodge, that's what it did, but they couldn't make Masons, and that's why they sought to establish a Grand Lodge. Anyway, I'll let somebody else talk, like that young junior past Grand Master that wouldn't talk a minute ago.
Thank you, Most Worshipful Brother Trout. Most Worshipful Brother Julius, where are you? I see two of you. There you are. Go ahead and unmute.
Oh, he's
Got it.
shut.
I'm sorry. I meant to turn the mic on and not the video, but I'm outside getting groceries with my wife. So give me 10 minutes and I will definitely pipe in.
Okay. Let's see. Who else? Let's see. Most Worshipful Brother Bill Miller. 1990, that was kind of your neck of the woods, was it not?
Yes, sir. It was at Grand Lodge in 1990 that we adopted the recognition resolution. And then it was Sid Case, the Grand Master the following year, who was the Washington Grand Master that presided at the Upton Cemetery. And I was not able to attend that. I can't remember now what my conflict was, but I had something. In the course of studying whether or not we ought to do that, I went back to the Upton proceedings, and he was right. Once we recognized Prince Hall, many Grand Lodges withdrew recognition from Washington. Unfortunately, that's still happening. Just recently, the Grand Lodge of California withdrew recognition from the Grand Lodge of Tennessee because Tennessee will not accept homosexual men. And that offends the Grand Lodge of California, and so they've withdrawn recognition from the Grand Lodge of Tennessee. I don't understand that, but they did. Anyway, I went back and I read the proceedings, and if you go back, I don't remember the year now, but it was like 1898, 1899, somewhere around in there. There's like 127 pages of letters that we got from around the world. And there was one in particular that really struck me. And it was from a Grand Master of a Grand Lodge in Germany. And he absolutely nailed what Freemasonry is all about and what that ruckus was all about. And to the point where I actually reproduced that and distributed that letter widely around the Grand Lodge of Washington. It's one of the better letters about what Freemasonry is all about and how it ought to be operated, and I recommend it to you. And again, you'd have, well, if you want it, I've got it, and somebody could just email me, and I'd be happy to redistribute it.
Yeah,
I'll do that, Bill.
I'd like to see that.
So, most Worship Brother Bill shared the idea that, yes, we got a lot of letters, and some of them were over the pale. Here's one from the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. And this is one that a lot of people have referenced. And it says here, and I quote, any suckling in Massachusetts who did not know more about Masonry than the writer of that report has manifested would be spanked and put to bed.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
I'm
very Masonic.
Again, Bill, I haven't seen that letter from Germany, but I'm guessing it was much more positive than that. That is for sure. Now, Bill, you brought, while I'm waiting for Julius, you put to work probably the most knowledgeable brother when it comes to foreign relations to oversee the recognition of Prince Hall, and that was Jim Wood, was it not?
Yeah. What the process was, we had some of our Grand Masters that preceded me that had started getting involved with Prince Hall. They would kind of on the sly attend some things and one thing or another, and that bothered me a little bit because at the time we didn't recognize Prince Hall, and I wasn't sure that we ought to be doing that kind of thing, and so I was really concerned about that. And the more I thought about it, the more I discovered I really don't know much about him. I don't know if there's a York Rite. I don't know if there's an Eastern Star. I don't know if they have Jobies or youth programs, and I really ought to know about that. And so I appointed Jim Wood, who was the fraternal correspondent at the time and a past Grand Master, to head up a team to do that research, find out for us what is this Prince Hall thing all about? What's going on? And about that time, Connecticut, I think it was the first modern era Grand Lodge that recognized Prince Hall. And then before we were able to do it, Nebraska did, and so we actually became the third one. But Jim led the discussion, teaching us about, finding out about Prince Hall and meeting with them and finding out what the organization was all about and one thing and another. And the more he discovered, the more we concluded, this is ridiculous that we don't recognize them. They're doing the same things we're doing. They're the same kind of guys we are, and what in the world is the problem of sharing jurisdiction? We ought to get around to it. And so that's why we had the resolution in 1990 to do it. It was not a unanimous ballot. It was overwhelming. I can't tell you the numbers offhand, but it was overwhelmingly in favor. But there's some interesting things that happened. I'm in another organization, and there happened to be a past Grand Master that was in that organization. And we had become pretty good friends. I hadn't known him before I became a member of that organization. And we had become pretty good friends. And after the 1990 session, when we recognized Prince Hall, he never spoke to me again.
Wow.
Never did. It's a sad case, but, that happens.
Thank you, Bill. Both to both Most Worship Brother Bill, Most Worship Brother James, I do appreciate the fact that you were there and that you can both bring to the table a perspective that most of us don't have. The perspective we have is the memories you share with us and the research that we're able to do. But to have that, if you will, boots on the ground insight is invaluable. With that, Most Worship Brother Julius.
Before you go to Brother Julius, Most Worshipful Brother Miller, can you give us your email so we can email you for the letter from Germany?
I'm working on that. He'll send it to me.
Okay.
You gonna put it in the chat, Jimmy?
If you send it to me, I can get it. I think I can get it in the chat.
Well, you have my email address, don't you?
I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah,
Let
so put it
me-
in the chat. And
Yeah.
if you don't see it in the chat, just email Jimmy and he'll get it to you, or I can get it to you.
So, most what's brother Julius?
Yes, most worshipful Mendoza.
I know you've been
Thank
chomping
you.
at the bit.
Well, thank you for the invite, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to invite more of our members to the chat, and to be able to experience some of the historical value of what the Grand Lodge of Washington has done, and when Prince Hall Masonry is concerned. I know I heard most worshipful Trout say that he was there, boots on the ground, and I was wondering, was he talking about the 1898 session? Because he does have a little bit of age on him, so I wasn't quite sure which one he was talking about.
Oh, you're bad.
But he knows I love him to death. So I really do. The story of William H. Upton to me was very important, and even when most worshipful Trout was speaking, and he talked about the recognition, the de-recognition of other Grand Lodges. Even in your library here in University Place, you have a copy of one of the letters from one of the states stating that they were going to break off recognition with Washington because of its acceptance of Prince Hall Masonry. And I always thought that was poignant that you included that letter in your library, because it stated to the fact of what most worshipful Upton believed in, and what the principles that he stood on, that those things are, it shouldn't be, and it wasn't like they went into this lopsided. They did the research first. They brought back the data. They brought back the eloquent report to the Grand Lodge stating, that the legitimacy of Prince Hall Masonry, and that made a lot of sense to me, and it should have made a lot of sense to a lot of people. But the bigotry of racism even withstood the teachings of Masonry, and as we go through life now and the situations that we face ourselves in now, those things still exist to some extent. I have a young brother who I made district deputy when I was a worshipful the Grand Master, who, when he was raised in Alabama, he went to the Grand Lodge building of Alabama, and while he was just admiring the art and the decor, one of the white Masons came out and told him the Prince Halls meet down the way a little bit, and he was dismayed by that, and he thought, going through the teachings of Masonry, that Masons couldn't be racist. So it really threw him for a loop. I know that now there are different factions of Masonry who believe one thing or another, but like you said, California has pulled recognition with other states because they don't recognize gays, and those are the same type of things that I think William Upton was standing for. Not necessarily that we should allow the gays, but a lodge has the autonomy to elect to make a member out of anybody that they want. And so if they allow them, then I think the Grand Lodges should step back and honor those things. So I just wanted to thank you for inviting us, and I know the story of William Upton. It's been I was raised in Pennsylvania, so let's get that right. I was raised to the degree of third degree of Masonry in Pennsylvania, and when I went to the Army and I got stationed in Germany, I demitted into Washington jurisdiction, and it just so happened that I got stationed in Washington State as well. I finished my Masonry here, and since I'm staying here and I'm not going back to Pennsylvania, I'm going to stay a member of Washington. And I was always proud to be able to say that Washington State is one of the early states to recognize Prince Hall, and
Yeah, there was excuse me for interrupting.
No.
There was a question from Steve Daisy about whether or not I used John Hairston's book. I did not.
Yeah, I wanted to address that too.
I
Here,
did
John
not.
Harrison.
I went to the original
Right,
documents rather than try to read somebody's interpretation.
right. John Harrison's book has been debunked by the Grand Lodge, the Conference of Grandmasters, and Prince Hall Conference of Grandmasters. There's a writing, there's a lecture that we put out, and I'll try to get that and disseminate that to you guys. I always wanted to give that to the Grand Lodge of us, and just never found the right time and opportunity. I don't like to disparage your brother or things of that nature, but he has his interpretation, but the facts and the archives show different, and so
Right.
That's what the Conference of Grand Lodge. They put a committee together who went back and did all the research and found all of his references and so forth and so on.
Yeah, thank you, brother. Most brother. I wanted to share with everyone this screen here. This is a copy of the this is a picture of the memorial that has been placed on Upton's grave, and it says what it says here. You can all read that. I don't need to read that to you, along with the dates. And as I mentioned earlier, there is the video of the ceremony that took place, and so it's one of those things where you especially when you look at a lodge like William H. Upton Naval and Military out in Bremerton, or when you look at any lodge building that has pictures of our past grandmasters or our worshipful masters, as the case may be. These are not just faces on a wall. These are individuals who gave of their best efforts to run our lodges, to run our grand lodges, and and put forth themselves to make decisions. Some of them in their eyes very simple. Some of them in the eyes of those who are looking in very difficult. But they gave of their best for us, regardless of what lodge we're in. They gave of our best for us, and so yes, when we talk about that, it is let's remember that as part of the one adjunct to this presentation is simply this: that yes, these are not just pictures on a wall. These are men who have done amazing things on behalf of our fraternity and ourselves. And by the way, Bill, I'm going to say this. You're here. I made a comment about this earlier, and I want to say this with you here. I was talking about my personal Mount Rushmore, and I'm struggling with the fourth face on my Mount Rushmore. You happen to be in that group of 6 people, and I'm struggling. I wonder if I could put all 6 of you into one place.
Sure.
It's
You got a whole side of a mountain. Add them all.
That's add them all. Yeah, why not, huh? But no, it's I've got my guys. I've got McElroy. I got Thomas Reed. I've got William Upton. It's that fourth place, and you're there. You're there along with a handful of others.
Well, I appreciate that, but I could make some suggestions for you too.
I'm sure
you know who my first choice would be for that.
That would be well, actually, you have a couple there. You have Bud Gilbert, and you have come on, Jim. I know this.
Yeah, Bill Horn.
Bill Horn. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. I know your 2 choices. So
once something like this gets started, Connecticut started it, and Nebraska jumped in there real quick, and then we did, and then there was it happened pretty good, and then you think, okay, so it's done, it's going to happen, and we'll be where we ought to be. We still have 7 or 8 jurisdictions that do not recognize each other. And I know people in several of those, and I see them and I talk to them and I say, what is going on? Because I know that in some places there's real active efforts to get it done. I can tell you in South Carolina and Louisiana are 2 places that I'm particularly familiar with. And I know there is really active efforts to get this done, and it will get done. But you hear interesting things. One of the things I hear back is, well, and I've heard this from places over the years, well, there's so many Prince Hall Grand Lodges in our jurisdiction, and we don't know which one to recognize. And I said, come on, that's bunk. They have a conference grandmaster just like we do. Recognize the Grand Lodge that belongs to that conference, for crying out loud, and get it done. And in a couple of places they moved in that direction. A couple of other places, though, the story I get is that the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in that jurisdiction doesn't want joint recognition. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story that they tell me. Eventually we'll get there, and it's just going to take some time, I guess.
I attended the Conference of Grandmasters in 2016 and 2017, and we were dead set on making sure that all of our Grand Lodges have open door policy with all of the Grand Lodges. And in fact, we wanted to push the conversation forward to make sure that those southern states convert. I know I was at one of your seminars when I was Grand Junior Warden, and you had, one of the speakers was from the Grand Lodge of Texas, who at the time hadn't recognized Prince Hall Masonry. And he and I had a brief conversation about this, whether his state would be pushing in that direction. And at the time he said, no, they were dead set against it.
That reminds me of a conversation I had several years ago with a past Grand Master from California. And his comment to me was, we have not, and we never will. We were at a meeting in Washington, D.C. in October. And at that very time, the Grand Lodge of California was meeting in San Francisco. And that was the year they recognized Prince Hall. So here was a past Grand Master who had no idea what was going on in this home.
In 2001, I attended a conference of Grand Masters, and the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Oklahoma felt that way. He said, absolutely not. There's no way in the world that he wanted to recognize or wanted to be recognized by any white Grand Lodge. He was completely satisfied to be exactly the way it was. And on top of that, he was a lifetime Grand Master. And,
yes.
Not where you change every year or every 2 years or every 3 years. He was a lifetime Grand Master, and his philosophy on that was that every other Grand Master that served in Oklahoma was a lifetime Grand Master. He didn't see any reason why he shouldn't be.
Goodness. So, Most Worshipful Jim, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, the last word is, rather than me dealing with several people, I'm going to shove the duty off on Most Worshipful Jim Mendoza. I will provide him these documents, and he will be happy to provide them to you. I really do appreciate your attention. I did not cover all of it. I think I covered the highlights. I think the important parts were covered tonight. And I can't disagree with any of the comments about, we're all on the level here, brothers. We're all Masons together. And as long as we keep that to heart, we can't go wrong. So thank you again.
Thank you. And again, on behalf of Most Worshipful Brother Jim, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Again, he'll get, like you said, the documents will come to me and I'll get them out to everyone. I see the Grand Secretary of Prince Hall has asked me to send him his way. So guess what? They're coming your way. And of course, Most Worshipful Brother Julius, we'll be sending the documents. I'll be sending the stuff your way as well. And I guess I'll see you next week.
And the headstone on past Grandmaster Upton's grave showed I was wrong. It was not 1992. It was 1991.
I wasn't going to say that.
Well, past Grandmaster Lunsford was in there from 90 to 93, so it had to be somewhere in there.
I just shared that video with everybody that's on my email list. So,
okay,
Jim, you should have it as well.
Thank you all for being with us today. This has been a wonderful evening.
Yes, it is.
I always enjoy being with. I know I enjoy being with my Prince Hall brethren. Thank you so much, brethren, District 13, and the Grand Lodge of Washington that are present with us tonight. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye now.
All right, thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye.